President Cyril Ramaphosa last night said that the special COVID-19 grant of 350 Rand will be extended by another 3 months. It was one of the announcements he made during the State of the Nation address on Thursday evening in Parliament. Dr. Natasha Vally has been calling for an extension of the grant. She joins me live now via Zoom. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. So what's your reaction to that announcement last night?
Thanks for having me, Nzinga. The extension of the COVID grant for the next 3 months does come as a relief, primarily because it buys time. But it's short-sighted to do this for only 3 months. And in its current form, it excludes caregivers. So you'll remember that last year at the end of October, the caregiver grant was already terminated. By excluding caregivers from the COVID grant, it means that those who are the poorest, and particularly women, are excluded from receiving the small cushion that the COVID grant provides. Also, many civil society organizations, community organizations, and trade unions have been calling, in addition to caregivers to be included, have been calling for the amount to be increased from 350 Rand to 585 Rand, which is the food poverty line. So the president's announcement really fell short of the demands of those who are most affected by the devastation of this pandemic.
All right, you're part of a campaign called Pay the Grants. If you can tell me about the experience some people who have been trying to access social relief have been having during the lockdown.
Thanks, Nzinga. So the first problem is that the caregiver grant was terminated, like I said, at the end of October. So even post-October, those women wouldn't be able to apply for a grant. Then the procedures have been long and onerous, requiring digital technologies that some people might not have. Oftentimes people would not receive a response or would receive a response late. And like this 3-month extension, it relies on people kind of not knowing what's coming next. And this uncertainty really is disdainful of people's realities. In addition to these things, of course, there are many who are excluded from claiming these grants. So we've seen migrants organizations speaking about how some refugees and asylum seekers have also not been able to access the grant that they should be able to access.
Mm-hmm. When do you see the demand for that COVID grant ending, and what would be the ideal scenario for those people who it's intended to benefit?
So you'll know that this country was the most unequal country in the world before the pandemic. And the pandemic has only intensified that. So any measures that are taken now cannot be seen as temporary measures. We cannot be putting measures in place that will last for 3 months or 6 months or even a year. We need to think of long-term ways to address the inequality in our country. And what organizations have been calling for, partly through the Pay the Grants campaign, is that the extension of the grant, hopefully, while the demands are to the end of March 2022, be seen as a bridge towards a basic income guarantee that will be a long-term monthly amount that guarantees a baseline income for everybody in the country. Now, you'll note that while we're told that the extension of the grant is impossible, you'll note that there was 45 billion Rand extra that Treasury received in revenue than they expected this year. And also, if one were to think about extending the grant for this year until the end of March next year, at the level of 585 Rand, which is the food poverty line, and to include caregivers, that would amount to between 55 billion and 75 billion. And that would make a fundamental difference to the lives of between 8 to 11 million of the poorest South Africans. And it would effectively, indirectly, support half of the South African population. If you consider that every beneficiary has at least 2 dependents and the kind of broader indirect networks.
What kind of discussions do you have with any members of parliament or government around these suggestions, and what's the reaction to them?
So more than 2 weeks ago, Pay the Grants campaign, along with other organizations who work with grant claimants or on behalf of grant claimants, including the Black Sash and the Institute for Economic Justice, wrote to the Presidency, the Minister of Social Development, and National Treasury requesting an urgent meeting because, of course, at that stage, it was nearing the end of January and the COVID grants were going to be terminated, and nobody had heard anything. We requested this urgent meeting to table our demands and to discuss social relief and grants in general. We've still not received a response about when that meeting can happen. And that, I think, like I said, shows carelessness towards those who are the most marginalized. We're still open to have this meeting. In fact, the urgency is even more pressing now. The 3 months buys us a little bit of time, but the Pay the Grants campaign is insisting that we get this meeting in order to table the demands of claimants.
You've written an article with Shayo Khan, you've spoken about the last extension of those grants for 3 months, saying that in part there was lots of pressure on President Cyril Ramaphosa, and that may be one of the reasons why the grants have been extended. What kind of pressure, if you're saying that, you've essentially been ignored, do you then place on the President, the Presidency, the Minister of Social Development and more, in order to try and ensure that you do get this meeting and have your suggestions about social relief heard?
In one way, this is a bit of a difficult question because it shouldn't have to take pressure from us for the government to institute policies and actions that benefit the majority of the population, that benefit the very women that the President discussed yesterday in the SONA, that the policies are meant to target and to address, the legacy of inequality in our country. So it shouldn't have to take pressure. But yes, given that nothing is being done, pressure does need to be extended. And hundreds of organizations have twice called on a basic income guarantee over the last year since the pandemic. And called for a basic income guarantee, and yet we've heard nothing. And you'll know it's difficult to take to the streets at the moment because of the pandemic. So I think that civil society organizations, community organizations that deal with food security, labor issues, really need to put a basic income guarantee as one of their top priorities. And in all our kind of pressures on the state, we need to table that as something that they fundamentally have to address.
Dr. Natasha Vally, thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon, giving us reaction to the State of the Nation address and the extension of the so-called COVID-19 grants. The State of the Nation address by President Cyril Ramaphosa drew mixed reactions.